Pick up the phone and your life ends. That is what people whisper about the Costello family. Ivy was just a tired girl in a 3XL hoodie who answered a 3 a.m. wrong number. She heard a murder. Then a dark voice whispered, "From now on, you're mine." Blinking against the harsh blue glare of her dual monitors, Ivy rubbed her eyes. It was 3:14 a.m. in Chicago. The brutal November wind was howling off Lake Michigan, rattling the cheap single-pane windows of her cramped Rogers Park apartment. Ivy Richards was 26, a medical billing specialist and severely overweight. At 250 pounds, society had long ago deemed her invisible. She spent her days fighting insurance companies over denied claims for Rush University Medical Center, and her nights eating cold takeout in oversized sweatpants, trying to scrounge up enough money to pay for her father's dialysis. Her phone buzzed on the cluttered desk. The caller ID flashed an unknown local number, 31255500198. Her heart seized. A call at this hour only meant one thing: her father's nursing facility, the Oak Park Care Center. Arthur Richards had been declining for weeks. Her hand shook as she grabbed the phone, almost knocking over a half-empty mug of stale coffee. "Dad." She breathed into the receiver, her voice raw and panicked. "Is it Dad? Hello?" There was a heavy, static-laced pause. The sound of harsh, ragged breathing echoed through the speaker, followed by a wet, sickening thud. "I told you, Lorenzo," a low, gravelly voice spoke. The voice was calm, chillingly smooth, and layered with a subtle Italian-American cadence. "You skim from the Costello syndicate. You don't get a severance package. You get the river." Ivy's blood ran ice cold. The Costello syndicate. Anyone who read the Chicago Tribune knew that name. Nicholas Costello was the ruthless heir to a criminal empire that controlled half the shipping ports and underground casinos in the Midwest. "Please, Dom," another voice, weak and bubbling with something wet, pleaded. "I have a family." "So do I." "And you stole from them," the dark voice replied. A sharp, deafening crack echoed through the line. The pleading stopped instantly. She clamped her hand over her mouth, a violent gasp escaping her lips. Her chest heaved against her oversized sweatshirt, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. Silence stretched on the line for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the dark voice shifted focus. "Who is this?" The words were spoken softly, yet they cut through the air like a straight razor. He hadn't dialed the cleaner. Lorenzo's blood must have smeared the screen, or perhaps his dying, trembling finger hit redial on the wrong contact. Ivy couldn't speak. Her throat had closed up entirely. "I hear you breathing." Nicholas Costello murmured the sound vibrating through the earpiece. "I can track this number in 60 seconds. Tell me who you are." She slammed the end call button. Panic, hot and suffocating, flooded her veins. She scrambled out of her chair, her heavy thighs knocking against the desk. She had to run. She had to pack a bag. She grabbed her purse, shoving her laptop and a few medications inside. But as she reached for her worn-out winter coat, she heard it. The sound of heavy tires screeching to a halt on the icy asphalt outside her building. Car doors slamming, heavy footsteps echoing up the creaky wooden stairwell of her third-floor walk-up. Crash. Her front door violently splintered inward, the deadbolt tearing entirely out of the cheap wooden frame. Ivy screamed, backing into the cramped kitchenette, clutching a cast-iron frying pan against her chest like a ridiculous shield. 3 men in tailored dark overcoats poured into the living room, their weapons drawn. And then he walked in. Nicholas Costello was a towering figure, radiating a suffocating aura of power and violence. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, splattered with fresh dark droplets of blood along the left cuff. His sharp, predatory eyes swept the pathetic state of her apartment, the stacks of medical bills, the cheap furniture, and finally her. He paused. The expectation of finding a rival spy, an undercover cop, or a hardened criminal completely dissolved. Instead, he found her a fat, trembling, completely unremarkable woman in a faded Looney Tunes sleep shirt, hyperventilating in the corner. "Put the pan down, sweetheart," Nicholas ordered, his voice echoing the exact terrifying timbre she had heard on the phone. "Before you hurt yourself." Please," she stammered, tears spilling over her flushed cheeks. She dropped the pan. It hit the linoleum with a deafening clang. "I didn't hear anything. I'm nobody. I'm just Ivy. I work in medical billing. I thought you were my dad's nursing home." Nicholas stepped closer. He was at least 6'3", his broad shoulders blocking the only exit. He studied her face, her soft jawline, her tear-streaked eyes. He stepped into her personal space, pulling off a leather glove. He reached out his cold knuckles, brushing against her cheek. Ivy squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for a bullet. "Ivy." He tested her name on his tongue. "You're a civilian. A terrified civilian girl who picked up the phone at the absolute worst second of her life. I swear to God, I won't say a word." She sobbed, her entire body shaking. Nicholas stared at her for a long, silent moment. In his world, witnesses ended up buried under the foundations of new high-rises on the south side. But as he looked at her terrified, entirely unthreatening form, something twisted in his dark eyes. A strange, possessive curiosity. "You're right. You won't," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Because dead women can't talk, and women who belong to me don't talk either." He snapped his fingers. Two of his men stepped forward. "Grab her laptop and whatever medications she needs," Nicholas commanded without looking away from her. "From now on, you're mine, Ivy. You live in my house. You eat at my table. You breathe when I say so. Try to run, and the men who handle my payroll will pay a very permanent visit to Arthur Richards at the Oak Park Care Center." Her breath hitched. He already knew about her dad. He had run her data in the 5 minutes it took to drive here. She was utterly hopelessly trapped. "Let's go home," Nicholas whispered, grabbing her upper arm in a grip of iron. The Costello compound was hidden deep within the affluent forested borders of Lake Forest, built on the bones of the old Armour estate. For the first 2 weeks, Ivy was a ghost, haunting a lavish gilded cage. She was confined to a guest suite larger than her entire apartment building, complete with vaulted ceilings, heated marble floors, and a balcony overlooking a private walled courtyard, heavily guarded by men carrying assault rifles. She expected torture. She expected a quick, silent death. What she didn't expect was the clothing. On the 3rd day, a terrified-looking tailor arrived. Within 48 hours, her closet was filled with expensive silks, cashmere sweaters, and custom-made dresses tailored perfectly to her plus-size frame. It was a jarring psychological manipulation. She was being treated not like a prisoner, but like a Mafia princess. Yet she couldn't leave her room without an armed escort. Nicholas's visits were the most terrifying part of her captivity. He would come to her room late at night, shedding his suit jacket, pouring himself a glass of Macallan 25, and sitting in the velvet armchair by the window. He didn't touch her. He just talked. "The Moretti faction is making a move on the shipping routes near O'Hare," he muttered one night, rubbing his temples, looking like a stressed corporate CEO rather than a mob boss. "They think because my father passed, the Costello family is bleeding out." Ivy sat on the edge of the king-sized bed, wearing a silk robe that cost more than her car, staring at her bare feet. "Why are you telling me this?" She finally found the courage to ask, her voice trembling. Nicholas's dark eyes locked onto hers. Because you, Ivy, are the only person in this city who cannot lie to me. My capos want my power. My enemies want my life. But you just want your father to get his kidney transplant. He reached into his breast pocket and tossed a crisp, heavy envelope onto the mattress. She reached for it with shaking hands. Inside was a receipt from Rush University Medical Center. Her father's account had been paid in full, over $200,000. Included was a priority listing on the transplant registry. Dr. Berman assures me Arthur will have a donor within the month, Nicholas said smoothly, taking a sip of his scotch. She choked on a sob, gratitude and absolute horror warring in her chest. He was saving her father's life to buy her total unwavering submission. "Thank you," she whispered, hating herself for the relief that washed over her. "Don't thank me," Nicholas replied, standing up and closing the distance between them. He leaned down his face, inches from hers, smelling of expensive cologne smoke and danger. "Just prove your worth. You told me you were a billing specialist, an accountant of sorts." He dropped a heavy leather-bound ledger on the bed next to her. "Look through the offshore accounts managed by Giovanni, my uncle's right-hand man. Tell me what you see." Over the next few days, Ivy became the Costello Syndicate's unwilling forensic accountant. Her weight, her awkwardness, her past life, none of it mattered when she was looking at numbers. She spent hours analyzing the coded spreadsheets. It didn't take long for her to spot the anomalies. Shell companies in the Cayman Islands were bleeding fractional percentages of profits before routing back to Chicago. It was a classic skimming operation, hidden beneath layers of fake vendor invoices. "He's stealing," she told Nicholas on a rainy Tuesday evening, pointing a trembling finger at a printed spreadsheet. "Giovanni is funneling roughly $40,000 a week into a dummy corporation called Apex Logistics. It's small enough to go unnoticed in your overall revenue, but it adds up." Nicholas stared at the paper, a muscle ticking in his jaw. The sheer violence simmering just beneath his skin made her shrink back into the plush sofa. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Numbers don't lie," she whispered, pulling her cashmere cardigan tighter around her soft stomach. 2 days later, Giovanni disappeared. The entire compound was on edge. Rumors swirled that Nicholas had personally handled the execution at a meatpacking plant near Fulton Market. When Nicholas returned that night, he didn't come to his study. He came straight to her room. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his eyes stark against his pale skin. Without a word, he sat heavily on the edge of her bed. Ivy froze, her heart pounding, as he suddenly rested his head against her thigh. It was a shockingly intimate, vulnerable gesture from a man who had just taken a life. She didn't know what to do. Tentatively, her trembling fingers reached out, brushing through his thick, dark hair. He let out a long, ragged exhale, leaning into her touch. "You're my lucky charm, Ivy," he murmured against the fabric of her dress. "The one real thing in a world of vipers. You belong to me now, fully." But her presence in the Costello mansion hadn't gone unnoticed. In the criminal underworld, secrets are currency. The Moretti family, Nicholas's fiercest rivals, had caught wind that the untouchable Nicholas Costello was keeping a woman in his heavily guarded Lake Forest estate. They didn't know she was a terrified, overweight medical biller. They assumed she was a devastatingly beautiful mob wife, a critical weakness. The danger became real exactly 1 week later. Maria, a quiet older woman who worked in the kitchen, brought her usual afternoon tea. Ivy was sitting in the solarium reading a book, grateful for the rare sliver of winter sunlight. "Thank you, Maria." She smiled gently as the maid set the porcelain cup down. She didn't make eye contact. Her hands were shaking violently. "Enjoy, Miss Ivy," she muttered, practically running out of the room. Ivy frowned. She reached for the cup, bringing the steaming Earl Grey to her lips. It smelled faintly off, bitter, like crushed cherry pits. Having watched far too many true crime documentaries during her lonely nights in Rogers Park, a massive red flag went up in her mind. Cyanide. She set the cup down so hard it rattled against the saucer. "Guards!" She screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet solarium. Two men burst into the room instantly, hands on their holstered weapons. She pointed a trembling finger at the tea. "Don't let Maria leave the grounds. She just tried to kill me." The resulting fallout was catastrophic. Nicholas returned home like a hurricane of wrath. Maria was dragged into the courtyard weeping and confessing that the Morettis had threatened her son's life if she didn't poison the Costello whore. Ivy watched from the balcony, clutching the stone railing, tears streaming down her face as Nicholas pointed his custom 1911 pistol at the maid's head. "Dom, stop!" she screamed over the courtyard, her voice cracking. He froze his head, snapping up to look at her. The monster was fully unleashed in his eyes. "She tried to take what is mine." Nicholas roared, the sound echoing off the brick walls. She was terrified. They threatened her child. She cried out, her heavy body leaning dangerously over the rail. "If you pull that trigger, you're exactly the monster they say you are. Be smarter than them. Use her." Nicholas stood perfectly still in the freezing wind, the gun leveled at the sobbing woman's head. He looked at her, the fat, terrified civilian who had somehow become his conscience, his accountant, and his obsession. Slowly, agonizingly, he lowered the weapon. "Lock her in the basement," Nicholas ordered his men, his eyes never leaving hers. "We're going to send a message to the Morettis, and Ivy is going to help me write it. Fear is a highly effective motivator, but vengeance is an absolute master." That was the lesson Ivy learned during her 3rd week inside the Costello syndicate. Instead of executing Maria in the freezing courtyard, Nicholas turned her into a weapon. They spent 3 grueling days in his mahogany-paneled study, crafting a narrative for her to feed the Moretti family. She was no longer just a terrified medical biller in a 3XL hoodie. She was becoming the architect of their ruin. Sitting across from Nicholas at his massive oak desk, she pored over shipping manifests and property deeds. She found a defunct warehouse owned by a shell company in Cicero, a place that had been bleeding money for years. "We leak this location to Vincent Moretti," she explained, her finger tracing a line on the sprawling blueprint. "Maria tells them you are moving your highest value offshore assets, millions in untraceable bearer bonds, through this warehouse on Thursday night. She will say you are personally overseeing the transfer because you don't trust your capos after Giovanni's betrayal." Nicholas leaned back in his leather chair, a glass of amber liquid resting in his hand. His dark eyes didn't look at the map. They were entirely focused on her. "It's a perfect trap. If Vincent thinks I'm vulnerable and distracted, he'll send his heaviest hitters to wipe me out and take the bonds. And when they arrive, they'll walk right into a bottleneck rigged with C4 and 20 of my best riflemen." "Exactly," she whispered suddenly, feeling the crushing weight of what she was doing. She was planning a massacre. She looked down at her hands, resting on her thick thighs, encased in a custom-tailored, dark emerald dress. "I'm sending men to die." Nicholas set his glass down. He moved around the desk with the silent, predatory grace of a panther, stopping right in front of her chair. He knelt, an act of shocking submission from a man who commanded an army of killers. His large, scarred hands rested on her knees. "You are surviving, Ivy," he murmured, his voice a gravelly caress. "You are protecting what is yours. Me, your father, your own life. He reached up his thumbs, gently wiping away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. You look at yourself in the mirrors of this house, and I know what you see. You see the girl who was ignored, the girl who was told she took up too much space. But when I look at you—" He stood up, pulling her with him. Ivy gasped as her heavy frame collided with his solid chest. His arms wrapped around her soft waist, pulling her flush against him. There was no hesitation, no disgust, only a fierce, burning possession. "I see a queen." Nicholas growled, his lips brushing against the sensitive skin of her neck, sending a violent shiver down her spine. "I see a woman with a mind sharper than a straight razor. A woman who is soft and beautiful, who I want to bury myself in every single night." His mouth crashed down on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was bruised, desperate, and tasting of expensive scotch and raw violence. Her hands, trembling and unsure, moved up his broad shoulders, tangling in his dark hair. For the first time in 26 years, she wasn't apologizing for her body. Under his touch, her weight wasn't a flaw. It was something he worshipped. He groaned his hands, exploring the generous curves of her hips, pressing her tighter against him, until the reality of their dangerous world faded into absolute heat. But reality in the Mafia never stays quiet for long. The trap was set for Thursday at midnight. Nicholas kissed her forehead in the grand foyer, slipping a heavy, custom-fitted Kevlar vest under his tactical jacket. He left her at the Lake Forest estate, surrounded by 12 armed guards, led by his second-in-command, a fiercely loyal enforcer named Matteo. "Lock the gates. Nobody gets in, nobody gets out," Nicholas commanded Matteo. He looked back at her one last time, his eyes promising a return. Hours ticked by. The mansion felt like a tomb. She paced the length of the grand library, her anxiety spiking. To distract herself, she opened the secure laptop Nicholas had left her. She decided to run one final audit on the dummy accounts Giovanni had been using before he was killed. She wanted to ensure every dime had been recovered. As she cross-referenced the routing numbers with the offshore bank in Cyprus, her blood ran cold. Giovanni hadn't been acting alone. The money he siphoned wasn't going to his own private accounts, nor was it going to the Morettis. She traced the final destination IP address of the wire transfers. It was an encrypted server. She recognized the digital signature because she had seen it on the mansion's internal network just yesterday. It belonged to Matteo. Panic seized her throat. Matteo wasn't guarding her. He was waiting for confirmation that Nicholas was dead. The warehouse in Cicero wasn't just a trap for the Morettis. Matteo had tipped off the federal authorities and the rival families. He was planning to let the Morettis and Nicholas wipe each other out while he swooped in to take the crown. She slammed the laptop shut. She grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. The house's jammer had been activated. She crept out of the library, peering down the grand hallway. 2 guards were stationed at the front door. Matteo was nowhere to be seen. She hurried toward the kitchen, her bare feet silent on the marble floor. She slipped out the servants' entrance, the freezing November wind biting through her thin sweater. She sprinted as fast as her heavy body would allow toward the sprawling garage. She found an old, unassuming Lincoln Town car that the groundskeeper used. The keys were in the visor. She started the engine, threw it into drive, and smashed the vehicle through the heavy wooden service gates at the back of the property, ignoring the shouts and gunfire that erupted behind her. She had 20 minutes to get to Cicero, or the man who had claimed her soul was going to die. Sirens screamed in the distance as Ivy tore down Interstate 290, her hands white-knuckling the steering wheel. The Lincoln's engine roared in protest as she pushed it past 90. She had never driven recklessly a day in her life, but the image of Nicholas bleeding out on a cold concrete floor pushed every ounce of rational fear from her mind. She pulled into the desolate, rusted industrial park in Cicero, just as the first explosions shattered the night sky. Flames licked the side of the massive corrugated steel warehouse. The deafening pop and rattle of automatic weapons echoed through the empty streets. She slammed on the brakes, abandoning the car in an alleyway. She grabbed the heavy flashlight from the glove compartment, her only weapon, and ran toward the chaos. The loading dock was a war zone. Bodies in dark suits littered the asphalt. Through the smoke and flashing strobe lights of a dying electrical transformer, she saw him. Nicholas was pinned behind a stack of rusted shipping crates, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, crimson staining his tactical jacket. He was firing a handgun with terrifying precision, holding off 4 heavily armed Moretti soldiers. But the real threat wasn't in front of him. It was behind him. Matteo had arrived. He stepped out of the shadows from the interior of the warehouse, a suppressed pistol raised and pointed directly at the back of Nicholas's head. Matteo's face was twisted in a cruel, triumphant smile. "Nicholas!" she screamed, the sound tearing her vocal cords. Matteo flinched his head, snapping toward her voice. It was only a fraction of a second, but it was all Nicholas needed. Warned by her scream, Nicholas threw himself violently to the right, just as Matteo pulled the trigger. The bullet sparked against the metal crate where Nicholas's head had been a microsecond before. Nicholas rolled his eyes, locking onto Matteo in absolute disbelief, followed instantly by cold, calculating fury. He didn't hesitate. Nicholas raised his weapon and fired 2 shots perfectly into Matteo's chest. The traitor crumpled to the ground dead before his knees hit the concrete. The remaining Moretti soldiers, realizing their ambush had failed and their inside man was dead, broke rank and scattered into the night as the wail of approaching police sirens grew deafening. Ivy ran across the open tarmac, her chest heaving, tears streaming down her face. She collapsed beside Nicholas, her hands shaking as she pressed them against his bleeding shoulder. "You stupid, brilliant girl!" Nicholas groaned, his breathing ragged. He dropped his gun and pulled her against his uninjured side, burying his face in her neck. "I told you to stay locked in the house." "Matteo was the mole," she sobbed, clutching his tactical vest, smelling the gunpowder copper and smoke. "He set you up. I found the transfers. I couldn't let you die." Nicholas pulled back, looking at her with a reverence that stole the breath from her lungs. The sirens were blocks away now, the red and blue lights reflecting off the broken glass of the warehouse. "We have to go," he said, his voice dropping an octave solid and unyielding. He managed to stand leaning heavily on her. Together they hobbled to his reinforced SUV, hidden in the shadows. As they drove away from the blazing ruins of his enemies, leaving the ashes of his betrayal behind, Nicholas reached across the center console. He grabbed her trembling hand, intertwining his thick fingers with hers, pressing her knuckles to his lips. "The Costello family is dead tonight," Nicholas murmured, staring at the road ahead. "The feds will find Matteo's body and the Moretti casualties. Let them think I burned in that warehouse." Ivy looked at him, her heart pounding. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the Empire needs a new name, a new structure, and I need my queen to build it with me from the shadows." He turned his dark, intense gaze toward her. "Arthur gets his kidney on Monday. After he recovers, we disappear. We rebuild together." 6 months later, the Chicago winter had melted into a humid summer. Ivy sat on the sun-drenched terrace of a private villa in Lake Como, Italy. She was wearing a flowing white silk dress that hugged every curve of her large, soft body. A diamond the size of an almond rested on her left ring finger. Inside the villa, her father was sitting by the fire, healthy, laughing and sipping espresso, completely unaware of the blood that had paid for his second chance at life. Footsteps sounded on the stone patio. Nicholas walked out, looking breathtaking in a linen shirt, his dark hair catching the Mediterranean sun. He approached her lounge chair, handing her a leather-bound ledger. "The new shell companies in Geneva are operational," he said, leaning down to press a deep, lingering kiss to her lips. "Awaiting your final approval, Mrs. Costello." She took the ledger, running her fingers over the embossed leather. She had answered a phone call by mistake, terrified and alone. But the man on the other end hadn't just claimed her. He had awakened her. She opened the book, picked up her pen, and smiled. The medical biller from Chicago was dead, and the Mafia's greatest asset had just been reborn. Thank you so much for watching this incredible story of survival, betrayal, and dark romance. If Ivy's journey from a terrified, overlooked girl to a powerful Mafia queen kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. Right now, don't forget to share this story with your friends who love thrilling, real-life drama twists. Subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss out on our next heart-pounding audio experience.